Hello, future celebrity. Welcome to another episode of How to Be Famous with Whitney Euland. I'm your host and your coach, Whitney Euland, and I am so excited for today's episode because we are going to be talking about the difference between old Hollywood fame, legacy fame, and fast fame, the type of fame that you can create in an instant by creating viral sensation. Now, to explain this further, I'm going to use the example of money. Okay, there's the difference that we all know of old money and new money. And old money is really that legacy money. It's usually passed down from generation to generation. It's usually gate kept. It's like you were either born into it or maybe you marry into it, but you don't normally just have access to that legacy money. However, money is just a resource. And even if you weren't born into legacy money, you can still create money. And this is new money. And in order to create new money, it's a completely different skill than leveraging existing money. If you think about old money, families are passing it down from generation to generation. They are usually investing it. They are living off of the dividends of their interest. Not every single person who has access to that money knows how to generate money themselves. Now, the same is true with new money. Just because you know how to generate money, you can make money really quickly. That doesn't mean that you know how to turn it into a generational asset that will help your bloodline for the rest of who knows. And I think what's really important is that money is a resource of leverage and of power. And so oftentimes people and generations and families who have had access to that money don't really want new people to have access to those resources because it levels the playing field. It kind of weakens their ability to control, to have the upper hand. And because of this, there's kind of a taboo reputation around new money, that it's gauche, that it's tacky, that people who have it don't really know what to do with it. They show off and they buy things just to impress other people. And obviously that definitely can be true. But for the people who know how to generate money and then leverage it, that's where the real magic is born. Now, the exact same thing is true about fame. So let's think about the difference between old fame, that like legacy fame where it was handed down, versus new fame. Now, this is the type of fame that in theory, anyone with an iPhone can create, because fame really is just the resource of having people's attention. And it's a really powerful resource. And once you learn how to leverage it, you can exchange it for the things that you want in life. You can exchange it for opportunities, for access, for money, for career fulfillment. You can ultimately create change, not only in your family lineage, but also in the world at large, which is why fame is such a powerful resource and why I'm personally on a mission to help as many good-hearted artists, creatives, influencers, and entrepreneurs create the resource of fame so that we can make the world a better place. Now, just like how there's a different skill between creating money and leveraging money, it's the same with fame, okay? Just because you know how to create fame doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to leverage it, or just because you know how to leverage it doesn't mean that you necessarily know how to create it. Let's think about old Hollywood fame. This is going to be that legacy fame. So old fame, I like to think of this kind of like the Lucille Ball, Marilyn Monroe, the Audrey Hepburn. Basically, you existed, someone scouted you, and then they put you into their existing systems. You would be seen in appearances, but they were all controlled by that system. So you would be in their movies or sing their songs or dance on their shows, those kinds of things. This is where you would see artists who would have to stage public relationships to promote a movie, for example. And if you were famous, that almost always guaranteed that you also had access to money. I think we should also note that this type of fame didn't only exist in the past. This is really any type of fame that's passed down from generation to generation. Now, this type of old fame is still seen as really sexy. All artists, creatives want to be in that Hollywood system because there's something elusive about it. This is where you start getting access to the trades, to publications, to magazines, to brand deals, to all of the things that we typically deem as being celebrity. So creatives say that that's the type of fame that they want, even though it actually can remove a lot of their authorship. But what I want to offer is that if you are wanting that legacy fame and you're unwilling to create this fast fame, the internet fame, it's actually your way of hiding, okay? Because it is so much more vulnerable to create fame than just to leverage it. Think about it. If you are going to create an online following, you're going to put yourself out there, make your own work, you are going to have to greenlight your ideas and you're going to have to practice them in public. And it's going to bring up a lot of friction in your actual real life because at first, no one's watching, and especially the right people definitely aren't watching. And so it's your friends, it's your family, it's you trying to become a new person, to step into a new identity while everyone around you is watching. And sometimes that can be really triggering because when you start putting yourself out there, you become a karmic mirror for other people. You basically create a gap in who you used to be and who you're becoming, and that gap is really triggering. And sometimes when people see it, they actually don't want to acknowledge that in themselves. They don't want to acknowledge that they could be putting themselves out there. They don't want to acknowledge that they could be going after their dreams. And so then what they do is they start to just subtly kind of reject what you're doing or not support it in the ways that you might want. And this isn't because they don't love you or they don't support you. Again, it's because of that inner friction that it creates for them. But the truth is, if you can build an online audience that is actually obsessed with you, I always say, like, don't start a cult, but do create a cult-like following of fans of you, of people that are rooting for you, of people that can get behind you, your mission, your story, all of that, then you're going to be able to leverage that into the career that you want, even if the career that you want is kind of behind those Hollywood gate-kept doors, which is why I'm ultimately such a fan of building an audience. So what is new fame? Essentially, new fame is when a person, right, a creative, an artist, an entrepreneur, puts themselves directly in front of the audience, and then the audience decides whether or not they are going to continue giving this person attention. It's a lot more vulnerable and potentially a lot more volatile, and you have to know how to leverage it yourself into different opportunities, but there are also a lot less limits, and you get more access to retaining the rights to your intellectual property. You can actually create the narrative that you want for yourself. New fame starts with self-authorship. It starts with a person deciding, hey, actually, I think I should be famous. I think I should be in the spotlight, and then generating that fame for themselves. It gets a little fuzzy here because people can also inject themselves into the old system. And what I mean by that is, let's say Kelly Clarkson was self-made, but she injected herself into American Idol, which then gave her leverage to get into the more traditional Hollywood system. Versus you can also now create fame for yourself using the internet. And what's really exciting now is that the internet kind of is a neutralizer because the audience gets to decide who has a platform and who doesn't. However, just because you created fame instantly doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to leverage it. This is why we get a lot of one-hit wonders, a lot of overnight successes that then kind of go nowhere. This is where we get people like the Haktua girl who had this huge rise to fame and then all of a sudden kind of disappeared out of the spotlight because she handed her fame and her visibility over to people that ultimately weren't trustworthy and didn't have her best interest at heart. So essentially, with old fame, it's basically like there is an existing structure of fame and a person can come into it and the structure will then give them access and get them visibility, but it still stays very contained. Versus with new fame, there's not an existing structure. It's an artist, a creative, an influencer putting themselves directly in front of an audience and then letting the audience decide whether or not they want to keep watching this person. Now, once they create that momentum, then they can leverage it into those opportunities and get into the old Hollywood systems if that's something that they want to do. Now, let's talk about the psychological cost of fame, because once you have a bunch of eyeballs on you, that does actually create dysregulation in your nervous system. And suddenly you feel like you have to answer to literally millions of people. If you think about, as humans, we've evolved from cavemen, cavewomen who basically evolved in tribes. We relied on our communities to literally stay alive. However, those tribes didn't have millions of people in them. They were a lot smaller. It was your family. It was there to protect you. Now, as soon as you move into the spotlight, you suddenly could potentially have millions of eyeballs on you at any given time, and our brains aren't really wired to know what to do with that type of visibility. Now, the reason that I'm saying this is because something that is very alluring about that old Hollywood type of fame is that there usually was more privacy around it. You would have more structures, more people, more systems in place that kind of created a buffer between you and every other person. Even though social media does obviously impact those celebrities that kind of have that old fame, they still have some shielding from it. Versus with new fame, you're on your own, kid. The cost of fame essentially is the same if it's new fame or if it's old fame, because it's essentially a difference of privacy. However, if you had old fame, again, you probably had more immediate access to money and resources to protect yourself, versus if you create new fame, you don't necessarily have those systems in place. You don't necessarily have an entourage of people who know exactly how to protect you. And that feedback is a lot quicker, right? You are actually reading the comment section of people in real time. You're receiving these messages, and our human bodies don't actually know how to process that much stimuli, those many eyes on us. And the reason that this is so important is that you have to have a regulated nervous system in order to continue showing up in the spotlight. You have to be able to do that again and again and again. And I think that's why so many creatives really struggle to actually leverage fame, and they end up burning out, is because they create this new fame and then they don't have the support and the systems around them to actually know how to sustain it, and they don't really know how to leverage it into the next thing. So in the past, especially if you had old fame, there were fewer people who had that resource, and so that inherently gave them more power. There was a time when we knew every single celebrity. It was like everyone in the country, everyone in the world knew the same people as celebrities. Now with new fame, there are people who I've never heard of who have literally millions of followers. There are artists who play sold out stadium tours that I've never heard of. And while that's exciting because it really means that there is more opportunity for you to create fame, it also means that there's less power behind your fame, which is why it's so important to learn how to actually leverage it. And all of this is why just because you know how to go viral doesn't mean you actually know how to create stability or how to sustain fame. I had a client come to me who has literally like 20 million followers. Okay, this kid is like very well known. I went out with him in public once and we had like 15 teenagers come up and ask to take pictures within the course of like a 10-minute walk. I had never heard of him before. And what was super interesting was that he actually has taken time away from posting and now is just surfing couches to get by. And to me, that's just crazy because if you think about in the past, someone having 20 million people know who this person is and yet they're not paying their bills, that's stressful. That's because they know how to create virality and not stability. Now, in the past, if someone had that type of visibility, that would almost guarantee that that meant that they had a team around them who would actually handle the business. But now, creating new fame, that's not necessarily guaranteed, and you essentially are the business. And so you are the person who is in charge of equipping yourself, of learning how to leverage fame, how to leverage your resources. But oftentimes, people who become creatives are specifically trying to not get into business, which is why it's so important to learn about business, to learn about how to leverage your fame so that you don't become a one-hit wonder. So let's talk about what fame is actually becoming, because I think we live in a time where there's a lot of distrust and a lot of misinformation, new things coming out with AI that are making it hard to know what's even real or not. But with all of that, I really believe that it's created this landscape where people are actually going to be able to rely on each other, to lean on each other, and to create even deeper communities. And to me, being famous, having the resource of fame is about being a leader. It's about leading a community and bringing that together. And I think that that's really where fame is going and why I'm so optimistic about our future. But that is going to mean that what fame looks like is going to continue to change. Because some of the gatekeepers are gone now with new fame, a lot of the mystique is gone, right? But that's where authenticity becomes even more important. That's why it's so important to build trust with your audience and to actually create real, profound human connection. Now, I know I sound like super pessimistic about all of this, and the truth is being in the spotlight is hard, and that's what I'm here to talk about. That's what I make these videos for. But you might be asking yourself, okay, well then why would I even go after this? And I want to offer that if you have the desire for fame, it's because it's meant for you. I personally believe that if you have this desire for fame, it's because you have a soul contract with millions of people who are meant to be inspired by you and by your work. And at the end of the day, that's what fame is really for. It's not for the money, it's not for the clout. It really is about the impact that we're able to make when we create it. I know that a lot of artists are really kind of grieving the past, grieving Hollywood the way they thought that it was going to look like. But the truth is, with new fame, there's actually so much more opportunity, because if you have that calling inside of you and you know that you're meant to make a massive difference, there's nothing stopping you. There are no gatekeepers holding you back from your audience and from being able to make the impact that you know that you're meant to be making. Now remember, fame is just fame, whether it came from old fame, from being passed down, or if you generated it yourself. But it's just a resource of having people's attention, and it's a powerful resource. That's what these videos are all about. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, follow along. And if you'd like to be part of my community, we will make sure that the links are in the thing under here. All right. I'm Whitney Yulin. This is the How to Be Famous. How to Be Famous. Thanks for being here.
Bye.
Millennial.
Bye.